99% of survivors of domestic violence experience financial abuse as part of the abuse that they suffer. So it's incredibly common. It's a primary tool of control that is a leading reason that survivors either stay in an abusive relationship, remain trapped in an abusive relationship, or return to an abusive relationship. So, on average, it takes about 7 times for a survivor to successfully leave a harm doer. And finances are a huge, huge, huge part of that.
Gloria Steinem once said, "We will never solve the feminization of power until we solve the masculinity of wealth." Barbara Provost and Maggie Nielsen are the team at Purse Strings that will help you navigate the ins and outs of financial independence so that you can be financially fearless. This is Women in Money, the shit we don't talk about.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Women in Money, the shit we don't talk about. I am so excited to dive into this topic today, which is not always the most exciting topic, but it's something that needs to be talked about. And every time we've done an episode relating to this topic, the feedback that we get, the ahas people get, the realization, I just know it's something we need to keep talking about. So with that, Joleen and Heather, before we get into the heavy stuff, let's start with who you are, what you do, and why you got into this work.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having us. My name is Joleen. I am a mom. I live in Portland, Oregon. I am also a survivor of domestic violence. I currently work at FinAbility. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. We work with survivors of domestic violence and stalking. And our focus is really on supporting survivors through their financial journeys. We know that 99% of survivors experience financial abuse as part of the abuse they suffer. And so we are lucky enough to get to work with survivors as they take on their financial journeys, deal with the fallout of financial abuse, and get to see them with a lot of wins and a lot of joys as well through a lot of hardship. I never intended to be doing this work. I was sure that I was going to be a journalist, but I just kept being drawn to this type of work. I volunteered at a shelter in college, and then my first job out of college was as an advocate. So I have helped survivors with a myriad of things that advocates do. So I've helped folks find housing, helped folks get restraining orders, attended court hearings, really such a gamut of things. And what I really love about the work that I do now, which I kind of said before, but I get to work with folks as they find a lot of resilience and a lot of strength through a lot of hardship. And I get to witness a lot of joy when they reach their financial goals. We also work with a lot of amazing volunteers who support survivors. So that gives me a lot of hope in the world that there's a lot of people who want to support survivors in this work.
Yeah, my name's Heather Wiese. I'm also in Portland, Oregon. I am a domestic violence survivor advocate for an organization called Raphael House, and we're a emergency shelter for domestic violence survivors and a prevention program. We have a lot of different parts of what we do. My program in particular is called Shelter to Stability, and I have the privilege of helping survivors succeed after they go to their own homes and they exit shelter. So I get to be in relationship with them, one-on-one advocacy. We run support groups, and I've been doing that for the last 6 years. And how I got into this is actually my first part of my career was at family homeless shelters. And one of the leading causes of homelessness is domestic violence. So I was constantly working with survivors for years. And I was really impressed and excited when we got to do things that help people change their relationship with money, to give them like financial literacy skills. So as I was doing my work, I was seeing just like light bulbs come on, like how they could finally learn how to save, how they could, even in extreme poverty, how they could change that relationship with money, how they could make their credit score go up. And I was just kind of learning as I went. I was very young when I started. And so I actually learned by teaching people alongside them, and was just really encouraged by the small things we could do with financial literacy to help people really find their footing again after experiencing abuse or addiction or houselessness. And so I switched over into domestic violence work kind of on a personal journey because I'm not a survivor myself, but it has touched every single relationship in my extended family and me very personally. And so I really still ask that question, even after like 16 years of working in shelters, like, why don't they just leave? And so when I had the opportunity to shift into this work, it was really partly because I wanted to understand that and see, what was behind this and how could we support these people who are, forced into making these decisions that, seem to hurt them. And so I love my work. I love to get to be that cheerleader with people. And, whether it's saving that first $10 they've never saved in their life, or seeing them, pay off a debt that they've had over their heads for years. It's kind of my passion and something I'm really excited to talk about.
Yeah, thank you both for coming on and doing the amazing work that you're doing. It's not going unnoticed. And so we appreciate that. So I know you guys on your website talk about the survivor led approach. And I think it's interesting that you offer or you honor every definition of survivorship, supporting those impacted by intimate partner violence, which I think is what we think of all the time, but also child abuse, elder abuse, and stalking. And so these are all different forms, which I think are really interesting. Do you guys find that you support all these pretty equally, or is there definitely like one more dominant than the other?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think at FinAbility, our definition of domestic violence and stalking is pretty broad for a reason. And we really do want to support folks who are in relationship with other people who are being harmed, who, the definition really of domestic violence is around one person gaining and maintaining power and control over another person. And that can happen in all kinds of different relationships. Speaking from my experience at FinAbility, I would say a majority of the folks we support are folks who are in intimate partner relationship, who are experiencing domestic violence, or the children of those who grew up in a home with domestic violence happening, even adult children who are, continuing to support a parent who are going through a lot themselves because of living in a home with violence. We certainly have also worked with folks, especially elderly folks who are being harmed by a younger family member as well. But I would say in large part, we are working primarily with adult survivors who are in unsafe or have been in unsafe relationships with an intimate partner. How about you, Heather?
Yeah, our program at Raphael House is primarily for intimate partner violence. So we do have multi-generational, though, families in our shelter. So we have had adult children with their parents. We've had grandparents with their children. We've had child survivors come back after experiencing abuse before. So, but our main population is for the domestic violence.
Yeah, that makes sense. It leaks over to all these different relationships, anybody in the house. I mean, it's not self contained in any way. And so for this podcast, we are going to be diving into financial abuse, but there is something else that is on your website that I really want to bring top of mind because I think like domestic abuse people hear about and are more familiar with, but you guys have something called technology abuse. Which, of course, now that we're on social media and technology is in our hands, living on our phones, I want to talk more about this and how you're seeing this because, we hear about kids and maybe some cyberbullying, which is still very bad, but different than kind of technology abuse. So I'd love to hear kind of what this is, what you're kind of seeing out there, and how we can start, being more aware.
Yeah, this is something that is becoming more and more prevalent and used again as another tactic of power and control. We work with survivors at kind of any point along their journey. We primarily work with folks who are in a little bit of a place of more stability. So, usually after they have left an abusive situation and are in a place where they can start thinking about their financial goals and kind of where they want to head in the future. And we'll talk about this more, but financial abuse can often continue long after someone has left an abusive relationship. And I think technology is a tool that is being used to continue that type of abuse. If you think about how often, in an intimate relationship, if you're married to someone, you have a lot of their information, right? So being able to use technology to access, logins to, access to bank accounts. There's a lot of tracking devices these days. So folks are being stalked using technology. So it's a really ever-changing field, and it's a lot to keep up with, but I think that this field is really starting to understand how it's being used so much and are really trying to respond to that. Yeah, I'd love to hear. I know Heather and I have talked about this, and I know I feel overwhelmed with it often, and luckily we have some resources that we call on quite often.
Yeah, this is something it's hard to keep your head above water with, and I've been recently seeing it play out quite a lot, and like she mentioned, it could be AirTags, even putting it in a kid's backpack so you can figure out what school they're at now if you have shared custody. There's so much technology that, like, you don't actually have to know that much about to get an app or download something that can get into people's emails. We have ring cameras. Ring cameras are really a common thing to have now. Lots of people have them. Survivors really like them to be able to see what's going on outside their apartments. There's ways to tap into those so that you can then see the survivor coming and going and manage what they're doing through that technology. There's selling information on the dark web. I mean, it's just like the things, it's like you can't even imagine sometimes the lengths and also the ease that it is to, especially for stalking, get access to somebody. So, like she said, we have some resources. It's not our forte, I think, with what we do, but the National Network to End Domestic Violence has a really great support called Safety Net. And that's a key one that I'll send people to and connect them with when they're having things that are really shutting down their ability to live their normal life.
One thing that I thought of while Heather was talking is something that we're seeing a lot more of that has felt like a surprise to me is the use of banking apps and cash apps like Venmo and Zelle to send threatening or demeaning messages. And this can be long after someone has left an abusive relationship and they're still having contact with an abusive partner in this way. So there's a lot of insidious ways that technology is being used, and grateful that we have partners like the National Network to End Domestic Violence, their safety net program to help us and survivors sort of navigate those really complicated topics.
Yeah, it's so hard because you want to stay connected. I mean, I've had stories where, people post on Instagram and then their partner shows, their ex partner shows up there after they like posted that location. Or, yeah, there's so many different things, like you said, with the AirTags. And I know we're trying to implement some new things of like, if you're around an AirTag that's following you, it will start beeping, but sometimes it's pretty faint. I've heard it. Like, it's also hard to hear. So, I'm glad we're just talking about that and bringing some light to it because, as great as this technology can be, it can also be really dangerous. And I think, yeah, just having someone, it used to be at least when I'm home, I feel safe. I have maybe my camera on the front door, but I know I'm safe inside my home. But when someone's on your phone, then kind of blowing you up from that standpoint, you never feel like you can be off and in that safe place, which is really hard, especially when someone is trying to heal. And so let's kind of move into financial abuse. And so when most people hear about financial abuse, I feel like they think, someone's hiding money or controlling credit cards, but it's something way bigger than that. So how does financial abuse actually look in real life?
I think something that people are always really surprised about when I talk about what I do and our work at FinAbility is that 99% of survivors of domestic violence experience financial abuse as part of the abuse that they suffer. So it's incredibly common. It's a primary tool of control that is a leading reason that survivors either stay in an abusive relationship, remain trapped in an abusive relationship, or return to an abusive relationship. So, on average, it takes about 7 times for a survivor to successfully leave a harm doer. And finances are a huge, huge, huge part of that. I think the average amount of money that a survivor has when they leave is $250. So, I think about trying to rebuild my life with $250, and that feels impossible. And so I think to Heather's point about saying, why doesn't she just leave? I think we often will cite that statistic to folks who feel really floored by that as well. So, yeah, the ways that we kind of talk about financial abuse, again, like you said, Maggie, that, people think about it in a really certain way. And I think it's important to also understand that financial abuse has a lot of crossovers into other types of abuse. And again, it's really a tool, a method of gaining and maintaining power and control, and really eclipses someone's safety and independence. So we like to kind of think about this in three sort of main pillars. The first is financial exploitation. So this can look like things like identity theft, creating fraudulent accounts and credit card applications. This can be direct theft from an account, a paycheck, or even benefits. We're talking a lot about coerced debt these days. So, this is where a survivor is forced into taking out loans that benefit a harm doer. And then we talked about the digital harassment piece as well. So, using those banking systems and banking apps and cash apps to harass somebody. So, survivors often then are bearing full responsibility of debt and credit damage that has lifelong effects. You know, there's loss of financial resources with that obviously prevent access to safety, access to housing, often means that folks feel like returning to an abusive situation is their better option. And then I would say that there's also a lot of fear and shame around even accessing financial products, banking systems, because they themselves can sometimes feel unsafe. So sometimes, you get the letter in the mail from your banking institution that says, "Oh, you've changed your address." Sometimes that can go to a former address, so the address of a harm doer, and can then identify the new address of a survivor. So sometimes we see folks who are really fearful of accessing those systems, which can also impede independence, impede options for safety. And then we talk about financial control, which is what you sort of talked about as well. So this is, restricting or controlling access to income or savings, either joint and independent accounts. This also can look like withholding documents needed to create a new account. So if someone is making a plan to leave or is just trying to have a little bit of independence, making sure that they can't do that because they don't have their ID, they don't have their passport, that sort of thing. Obviously, technology is very involved in this, so messing with passwords, monitoring transactions, monitoring ATM transactions, and then, of course, there's a lot of surveillance and then punishment within those relationships. So I've worked with folks who've been kept on a really unrealistic allowance, essentially, and there's punishment for not sort of meeting the needs of the entire family on a really unrealistic budget. So folks are going with their basic needs being unmet, safety options are completely out of reach. And again, that like really deep fear and shame and confusion around financial institutions, financial decisions. We see this play out in our financial mentorship program where some of our mentees come into the program and are say things like, "I'm so overwhelmed. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not where I should be, and I just don't even wanna open my bank account and look at what I have. I don't wanna open my mail because there will be bills in there, let alone trying to look at my credit report and understand what that is and or kind of dive into what that could mean for my life." So a lot of disconnection from their personal finances, which can lead to more long-term financial instability. And then finally, the third sort of pillar that we talk about is financial sabotage. So this looks like intentionally damaging credit, also can be intentionally damaging personal property. So I've worked with someone whose harm doer intentionally after they had separated created a lot of damage to their rental apartment, and the apartment was fully in her name, and then that was a really dark mark on her rental history, therefore making it really hard for her to find housing in the future. So again, undermining that housing stability or rental history. Something we hear about a lot that's maybe not talked about as much is interfering with work or education or caregiving responsibilities. So we a lot of stalking behaviors happening. So someone goes to work, abusive partner or ex-partner is calling all the time, showing up all the time. Maybe that's preventing someone from going to work, either physically doing so, refusing to take on childcare responsibilities. So it makes it impossible to go to work or school. And then on the other side of that, another pretty dark side is that we've also worked with folks who have been forced into sex work or prostitution to ruin a reputation, but also to, really benefit the harm doer. And yeah, intentionally sabotaging accounts, freezing funds, totally draining an account. I feel like we hear that a lot. And then manipulating legal or child welfare systems to really maintain financial dependence. We hear about that a lot post-separation. But I'd love to hear from Heather. I know you probably have some experience and stories around that as well.
Yes, unfortunately, I do. But most of the work that I'm doing now is with folks after they leave the abuse and they're, in safety. Like I said, they're in their own homes. And it continues after leaving, unfortunately. And so the impact is very long term. And, it can really make and trigger a person when they're trying to move forward in their life. Anytime, like she said, opening that, bank account or looking at your credit report, it's an on paper reminder of what happened to them. And so it's really overwhelming. And I'll start by, safety planning. We're trying to untangle those accounts because the first thing sometimes is retaliation once they leave. And I have permission to share this from a survivor, but there was a person that I am working with right now who was married for 40 years. She was married to a firefighter, someone who was very upstanding in the community, had a lot of connections. They had a huge pension, and she was being physically and sexually abused within her marriage. And she finally left, and the retaliation was to drain all of her life savings, including her own parents' inheritance from that account. And then because they're going to go through divorce proceedings, put it into an offshore account. So it was no longer even visible. And she said that experience was as violating and impactful as the sexual assault that she experienced in her marriage. And so these are this is their lives. It's not just about money. It's not just about our credit score. This is making it so people can't actually, thrive and take care of themselves. Another thing that we mentioned, the credit report, that is anecdotally, I've been told by people that they are more anxious and afraid to access and look at their credit report than they were to leave their abuser because of that long-term impact, because it's concrete, it's something there. And they feel also like because they maybe don't have always the knowledge or the financial empowerment that others have to know what to do with it. So, it's very overwhelming. It's very overwhelming to look at that. Also, this is my PSA. I just have to throw this out there because so many people don't realize this, but the credit report itself is really like a point of safety for people. She mentioned, like a bank account, you change your address, the abuser might get the address sent to them. But if you have been in a long-term relationship with someone, they're probably going to know your social security number, your birth date. They may be able to answer basic security questions about, your mother's maiden name, where you lived before, things like that. And so they can get access to that credit report. Well, now, when you apply for any kind of credit, you have a soft pull on your report, right? So it shows I went to AT&T in Oregon. I applied for a place to live in at this address, and it will show up on those credit reports. So then we have another point of access for abusers to find someone and locate them. So it's like my PSA. Even advocates don't even realize that. That's like a little loophole. So then we have to get really creative with that. We maybe have to run our credit through a different way, like out of state at a different bank. We want to create maybe different pathways for survivors to get to their credit without it causing harm. The good news is that I do see people get out of this. Once they're walking alongside someone, whether it's a FinAbility mentor, financial mentor, in their local coalition, domestic violence coalition, there's, they can connect to financial empowerment programs. But walking alongside the advocate, you can start to look at those long-term effects of what's going on, and you can sit with someone and say, hey, I'm here with you, and we're going to do this step by step together. So, but yeah, it's very long-term and very impactful beyond leaving the harm doer.
I think these were so many great examples just to bring to light. I mean, I could say so many different things right now. It gets you fired up, but it also really, makes you think about how on guard the survivor needs to be, because these systems are not made, for a survivor, right? And so, of course, somebody you've been married to for 40 years knows your social security number. I mean, that'd be crazy for them not to, right? And so it's just, of course, they have this access. It's being followed around. And so being anxious about that, mail being sent and these different things, I mean, it's always on edge, and it's hard to listen to because I know so many women who are not being abused or in these situations don't want to look at their credit score anyways, much less seeing, what this relationship has done. And, the creditors, they don't care. They really don't. They want their money. And so it's hard to reason with that and share your story again and again of, this is why I shouldn't have to pay this and these different things. I mean, you can put up the fight, but that's also so taxing on that person as well. So it's so challenging. And I'm glad you guys are here to support women and have some resources and some workarounds to do these things, because it does seem like it's coming at every point in turn, which is really difficult. Yeah, especially if you're on the allowance, if they're watching all your spending, all these different things. I mean, it's a lot. It's a lot. And I appreciate you being able to support women through this. And so I know we've talked about this a little bit, but like it doesn't stop when the survivor leaves. Sometimes it gets worse. And so I know you guys talked about some of those examples of the mail and people still being able to follow you and still hack into any of your accounts. Is there anything else that you kind of want to share of what it's actually happening to women after they've already gotten out? Any other ways that you've seen it almost get worse that people should know about almost to protect themselves?
I'm just thinking about how she mentioned work and how it can prevent people from being able to get jobs, promotions, things like that. The fallout of that is like a spotty work history. So I went to a conference and a nurse was sharing about how she was a fantastic nurse and she would get a job. And every time she would get a job, she would get fired because she either have to call out because she had visible bruises all over herself, or she had to, avoid whatever was going on at home or he'd find her again. So then we get this shoddy work history that then impacts, someone's career. I would just want to mention child support because this is like one of the main things that abusers will, and we don't think of it as financial abuse, but it is. Not paying your child support by changing your job every few months because they will then catch up with you and they'll start garnishing your check is financial abuse. And so that is something that, has to be fought in court again. Like we're back into systems that maybe they don't trust. And when I tell people, participants, that's a form of financial abuse, it's like, what? Like that is, even the participants don't have the language for it. And we'll do these, educational things. They'll be like, I knew about emotional abuse. I knew about physical abuse. I knew about those things, but I didn't know there was something called financial abuse. And then those light bulbs go on. And then again, we're just trying to break down, I'm constantly safety planning with people. So it's not a one and done thing. It's not like, oh, you're out. We're safety planning. The safety plan is ready. It's set. We're doing that. I've been working with people, the same people, sometimes for 5 years or more. Now, this is my program. I get to stay with people long term. And I get to not only see them thrive and grow, but also see when the abuser comes back into the picture. And so we have to just keep looking at things. I think that's maybe to take away from the ongoing is it's not a one and done. You have to keep checking your credit report. We have a thing called the address confidentiality program where they can put and this is offered at many different states, but they can make it so their mail is actually forwarded through the Capitol and goes to a PO box and then it's mailed to them. So they don't have to put their names in systems that are easy to then find, like the DMV or DHS, or being a voter registration is very easily to access where you live. So things like that, just constantly kind of having to check in with people and see, how are we doing? Do you have points of, maybe access that you haven't thought of? So I think that's just something to take away is it's just not ever maybe over, which is really sad.
I mean, it is, you think, oh, they got out. And you're like, yes, and they're still fighting all these other things, right? You're still fighting up against this. They still don't feel that safe and secure yet, which understandably so. I think it's when women learn about financial abuse, it's not to be like, oh, well, now I know I'm a victim. But we hear so many women say, I should have known, I should have done this, I should have done that. And it's not for you to blame yourself. It's outside of your control, which I think, especially, I mean, we work with so many women. I'm only a woman, so I can only share our perspective. But it's always the shame of I should have known, I should have done this. It's me, it's my fault. It's these different things where it's not. You have to look outside of that and it's not in your control. And Heather, kind of like you were saying, they keep going back to court. Sometimes I know people who are like, well, paying for the attorney, paying for the time out of work, is it worth that fight? which is, again, kind of letting them win? Is it going through the system that I don't trust, And so it's just always this pigeonholed corner of, what should I do? Because, by the end of the day, all the money's going to end up going to the lawyer, right? Like, it's this whole process that's just so difficult to navigate. And, now 2026, economic pressure, inflation, housing costs. I mean, Jolene, I think about the $250, which, 10 years ago might have got you a little farther. But today, I mean, that might get you a hotel room for one night. Like, that maybe. And so, what's the current landscape looking like for survivors who are trying to get financially stable? I'm assuming it's harder than what it used to be. But what do you need people to know about what's really going on out there?
So I've been in this field for so long and actually started in 2003 just working with people in, shelters. And so it's funny because when you say, is it worse now? It's actually, we were on an upward trajectory, I felt like, for a while. We were, definitely from 2003 to 2020, we were doing better with, awareness, with tenant education and tenant rights, rent control. There was more assistance. There's a more conversation about affordable housing, things like this. And so, and then, COVID hit and we actually ran into a lot of money, that was given to nonprofits to further people forward. And so we kind of had this moment of like, oh, I think things are going better, in general. We're going at least this way. I think that right now is what we're experiencing is just a lot of fear. It hasn't necessarily played out in front of my eyes in the impacts yet. But we know that these impacts are coming. We know that funding is being cut. We are, the budgets of our state, and we've talked particularly about Oregon and Portland in general, but, there's a lot of budget deficits. There's a lot of things on the chopping block right now. There's been a lot of fight behind that, so we haven't seen it necessarily what the impact is yet. We have a program called the Emergency Housing Voucher Program. These are basically like a Section 8 voucher given with permanent supportive housing. So they are given with some client assistance and some case management. And these are for the most vulnerable survivors who cannot work or have disabilities. For whatever reason, they're unable to sustain themselves long term. So they need these. This is a need. And those have been told that they are no longer permanent and they will be being taken away in November. This is hundreds of families in Portland that will be essentially homeless because they have no other options. So that, I think, once that, if that actually plays out, I mean, we're doing the best we can to fight it in legislation and like going to, the local meetings and things like that. But I mean, that is where I feel like, wow, I mean, I have not seen that kind of impact in such a drastic way since I started this work. But we definitely have seen, when they've said, there's been some funding that said, we're going to cut it. And then we've pushed back and we've gotten that funding still. So using our voices is still effective and important. We can't just roll over. But yes, there's just, I think in general, there's just a lot of fear from survivors who are relying on those kind of supports.
I agree. I think since January of 2025, the landscape has continued to change, and there's a lot of unknowns and things that have really shifted, and cuts and promises to cut, things changing. And I think on the ground, survivors feel that, and survivors are sort of saying, oh, the system of support that has been there for a long time, that is part of my safety plan, is changing and shifting. And so that does cause a lot of anxiety and fear. And so I guess I would say to folks who are able, support your local domestic violence shelter, support your local domestic violence programs, whether that's, volunteering, or if you can give funds, go to their galas, those sorts of things. We just really need that type of support. We don't know what is ahead. And, I think we're all feeling like, for example, like I filled up my car yesterday and I was like, holy moly, this is crazy. So imagine if part of your safety plan is driving somewhere to a safe family or friend, and your limited $250 is now going to have to stretch much farther. So supporting organizations that support survivors, I think, can be really powerful. And just one more soapbox that I'll stand on is that we're in a time where there's a lot of talk about survivors, and try not to get too political, but I think survivors right now are feeling like people don't believe survivors. And I think just standing forward and saying, I support, I trust, and I believe survivors is incredibly powerful. I hear from participants in our program all the time about how this time, this day and age just they feel really invisible. And so I think stepping forward and using your voice, like Heather said, in all these ways can be really powerful. So
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because we have to be heard. We have to be believed. Otherwise, people are going to be like, why didn't you say anything? It's like, what difference would that make? But let's talk about resources before we ask our last question. What resources are out there? Tell me about, what you guys are doing. I know you're more Portland specific. So what other resources might you know about across the nation? Because we've talked a lot about a lot of bad situations, but we want to help women get out of them. So how can we help there?
yeah, the thing I say generally there's two things that I kind of say about folks who I maybe don't know where you are. You might not be in Portland, you might not be in Oregon. So there's the National Domestic Violence Hotline. That's a great place to start. You can call and you can ask about what your local resources are. And no, that's just your starting point. And then I would call that local resource and really understand what the programs are on the ground. There's all kinds of innovative programs happening right now. So, for example, Raphael House, where Heather works, it's not just a shelter program. They have all kinds of incredible support to survivors. And I think that's a really wonderful thing to know that maybe you're looking for, just support, someone to talk to. Knowing your local resources is really helpful. The other thing that I'll mention is an app called My Plan. This is an online decision making and safety planning tool. This is for the folks, often myself included, who doesn't feel comfortable picking up a phone and making that phone call and like having to talk. This is a really great tool. It's personalized, so you can put in what your situation is, what you hope your situation will be. It's also a great tool for friends and family members who know survivors. It has a whole side of it that is for how to be a supportive person to a survivor. And I think that I have learned a ton from it being, in this field for a really long time. So I would say that those are two really great places to start. In particular, thinking about financial abuse, I think the National Network to End Domestic Violence, they have several programs focused on financial empowerment and financial and economic justice. And they're also a great place to start. But Heather, I'd love to hear your thoughts about resources as well.
Yeah, you stole one of mine. I already plugged the NNEDV, with the safety net for their tech support, but they do have some really innovative programs. There's some programs that are doing really amazing things with matching savings. You may have heard of IDAs, but these are for like specific for survivors. There are so many good. I've gone to the NNEDB Financial Empowerment Conference for a couple of years, and hearing from different states, those coalitions are being really creative in how they give resources to survivors. One that I would say from that website would be the Independence Project. And this is just a really basic way to start building your credit. I've referred this out several times, even the last month, for people who are like, I can't approach that debt. I don't have the ability to, take on debt repayment, or it's too scary or emotional, the capacity isn't there. But they can have a micro loan through the Independence Program, and it's $100. You take out a loan, it's zero interest, and they pay it back over 10 months, $10 a month. And it helps their credit score go up. So it's just something like that where it can give just a little bit of glimmer of hope in those situations can really change someone's agency. They can feel like there's something I can do. I'm not completely helpless. And it can, just 1 degree off the track, we're heading in a totally different direction than we were. We are not heading off a cliff. We're going to go somewhere nationwide. It's really looking at what's in your state, what's in your city, what are your local empowerment programs for survivors that are accessible.
Yeah, those sound like a lot of great resources. I'm excited to get all those in the show notes and all that stuff so people can have those resources to reach out to, as you're not alone. There are so many people in every city doing this great work. And so we want to make sure if you need the resources, you can get your hands on those for sure. There is a question we like to ask all of our guests, so I'd like both of you guys to answer. We ask every guest this because we think it matters. And so what does financial freedom mean to you personally?
I would say for me, if I were to distill it down, it is choice and options. And that can be so many different things. We can talk about it in terms of safety. We can talk about it in terms of how you want your family to look, what kind of like career and job you want. And I think just being able to have choice and options as a woman in this world right now, I think those things are incredibly important. So, yeah, wonderful question.
I think for me, it's not about having all the money in the world, but it's about having the power of knowledge in the choices I get to make, and also having peace in those choices. Like having that, I really do. We have to do a lot of healing from money trauma and our relationship with money to even interact with it. And so for me, having that freedom to not be afraid of money and looking at it, but being able to have peace around it, knowledge around the choices I make, and not live out those with shame and regret. That feels like freedom to me.
I love it. It's awesome. Well, I appreciate you both for all the work that you're doing, coming on and sharing these stories, because we need to keep talking about this shit. We really do. We need to bring light to it and make it less taboo. I don't want any more women sitting in shame or in these relationships where they feel like they can't get out. There are resources out there. We want to support you. So I appreciate, you sharing this message today. I encourage any listeners to, take an action, to share this with a friend, to keep the conversation going, as we just have to keep talking about it. So thank you, Heather. Thank you, Joleen. And until next time, be financially fearless. You've been listening to Women in Money, the shit we don't talk about. Now it's time to take what you've learned and make bold moves towards financial independence. Stay in the know by joining our newsletter for exclusive tools, resources, and updates that keep you financially fearless. Head to pursestrings.co and sign up today. Need a financial professional who gets it? Turn to PurseStrings' curated directory, your go-to resource for financial experts who know how to put you first. Love this episode? Leave us a review and help us empower even more women to own their financial power. Until next time, be financially fearless.